Good evening. I'm Lena Moore, and as Deputy Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Clinton Presidential Center tonight. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us for the debut and celebrate our newest exhibit, Jazz, Through the Eyes of Herman Leonard. This collection of photographs and memorabilia celebrate the uniquely American art form, jazz. The iconic photographs come from the Herman Leonard collection, and the memorabilia is on loan from museums and private collectors such as the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum, Quincy Jones Productions, and our own President Clinton. President Clinton's appreciation of jazz is long-standing and well-documented. And as many of us know in this room, he is an accomplished jazz saxophonist, after all. Quincy Jones said, "When people think of jazz, their mental picture is likely one of Herman's." Herman Leonard captures the artist in their element and in the moment. He tells the story of jazz, artist by artist. Artists who have been so influential, we don't even need to say or hear their last names. Artists like Miles, Duke, Count, Dizzy, and Ella. So we are thrilled to bring this world-class exhibit to Little Rock. An exhibit that was recently presented at the Grammy Museum in Los Angeles and at the Lincoln Center in New York City. And now it's here. Each museum has to uniquely design traveling exhibits, such as this one, to fit just right in its space. And at the center, this requires a collaboration among our team members from the Clinton Presidential Library and from the Clinton Foundation. And so I want to take the time to thank you all for your hard work on this exhibit, particularly Chris Mao. Chris Mao, where are you? Our curator, Chris Mao. Please raise your hand. Great job. Thank you so much. Yeah. Mr. Leonard passed away in 2010. Leaving both a tremendous void and a remarkable legacy. So tonight, we are so honored that Herman Leonard's daughter, Shana Leonard, and her husband, Stephen Smith, have joined us tonight. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to Little Rock. Shana and Stephen will lead our discussion, and then they'll take a few questions from the audience. And after that, we will hear from Little Rock's own jazz legends, Rodney Block, and the real music lovers. And after the performance, we encourage you all to come back downstairs and tour the fabulous exhibit and join us for a wine and cheese reception. So now, please help me welcome our special guests, Shana Leonard and Stephen Smith, to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I want to start by saying thank you for this wonderful reception. I'd like to thank President Clinton for his appreciation of my father's work and for making this exhibit possible. My deepest gratitude to Lena Moore and the Clinton Foundation and to Christine Mao, who have worked so diligently to curate this exhibit. To Joyce Cuban and all of the people here at the Clinton Presidential Center. I want to thank all the museums and the family estates of the artists that have contributed to all these incredible artifacts. My thanks to our friends that have traveled long distances here today. Hold on, where am I? And lastly, to the people of Little Rock, who have been so kind to us during this visit. My father would be honored and thrilled to have his work here at the Clinton Presidential Center. He was a huge admirer of President Clinton, and I am confident that he is here smiling over us today. As a photographer, he was always traveling somewhere in the world. He loved meeting new people from all walks of life. whether they were a famous celebrity, a person sitting next to him at a counter over breakfast, or a musician playing in the streets. He had a natural ability to disarm a stranger of any apprehensions, which then opened a door for him to become close with his subjects and to create these beautiful and intimate portraits. After he graduated from Ohio University, he went to Ottawa, Canada, to intern with the famous portrait photographer Yusuf Karsh. He assisted him in photo shoots with Albert Einstein at Princeton University and Harry Truman in the White House. Karsh told him, Leonardo, which he liked to call him, always tell the truth in your photographs, but do it in terms of beauty. In 1948, he moved to New York City into a little studio and set up shop as a portrait photographer. His customers were primarily actors working on Broadway, but his passion was jazz music. He would ask the club owners if he could shoot rehearsals of the musicians during the day. In exchange for his free admission, he would give them prints of his photos for their marquee. He always said the camera was his open sesame into places he normally wouldn't have access to. He took these photographs for his personal enjoyment and cherished the relationships he had with these musicians. In 1956, he was offered a job to move to Paris and work for Barclay Records. After just traveling through Asia as the personal photographer to Marlon Brando, he was eager to experience new places and the thriving jazz scene in France. Although I was born long after these photographs were taken, the music of these jazz artists was always part of the soundtrack to our lives. I grew up playing in my father's photo studio in Paris, where by the 70s he was making a living primarily shooting fashion for the couture houses and catalogs, or taking his family on long trips for his documentary work in places like Morocco, Thailand, Afghanistan, and Bali. We eventually left Paris and moved to an island off the coast of Spain called Ibiza. His jazz negatives that he shot in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were packed away in boxes under the bed. It wasn't until the late 80s that he decided to pull them out. They had been in these boxes for 40 years. At that point, we were living in London, and he decided to make some prints and took them around to galleries to see if anyone would want to do a show. They told him that they were very good shots, but there wasn't any market for jazz photography. He was feeling pretty down and lost at the age of 65 and without much hope of finding a job as a photographer. Then a little gallery near Notting Hill offered him an exhibition. The London Times did a multi-page story on the show, and the BBC came and did a piece for the evening television news about the discovery of these unseen photographs. In the first month, over 10,000 people came to see the exhibit, and his luck changed. He moved back to the States and eventually ended up living in New Orleans. He said that he never felt so at home in his skin as he did living there. However, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the city, and his home and studio were flooded by 8 feet of water. His life's work of nearly 8,000 prints were washed away. He spent the last 5 years of his life in California, archiving and preserving his negatives that had been stored at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art just prior to the storm. He continued to make prints and received many awards and honors from his peers. I am happy today that we can all look into the past through my father's viewfinder, into this glorious period in American music history, and for the moment, feel what it must have been like to be in a smoky New York City club with Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and Charlie Parker. Thank you again for this wonderful reception, and as my father always said, enjoy the music. Now I'm going to turn things over to Steve, and he's going to do a short PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. It's great to be back in the South. Especially love the brown sugar pie over at the Capitol Grill. Wow. When I first met Shana 20 years ago, she told me her father was a photographer who had shot some jazz artists, and she gave me a copy of his first book, The Eye of Jazz. I had worked in music and with photographers for many years, but when I opened Herman's book, it was totally unexpected. They were the most beautiful portraits of musicians I had ever seen. They were all of the giants of American jazz scene: Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Miles Davis, Frank Sinatra. And the images were so spectacular. They had such rich clarity that you could literally count the eyelashes on the faces. And his unique approach to atmospheric lighting and the shadows across the faces and the smoke that filled the room. Herman captured this world like no one had done before. These photographs largely were taken in the late 40s and 50s during the time of the Jim Crow laws that mandated segregation in all public facilities. And the jazz music that carried us through World War II was swing music played by big bands to mostly white audiences. However, a new modern jazz form began after the war, and this was the time when bebop music appeared and began to symbolize the civil rights movement. Even though African-American musicians like Duke Ellington became very popular with white audiences in the 1920s, they weren't allowed to play in bands with white musicians. And even when the white band leaders like Benny Goodman began to hire black musicians to join his band, they often were denied entrance to venues or to stay in the hotels with their white bandmates. The bebop movement empowered minorities and brought white and black people together on the stage and in the audience for the first time. The music encouraged the artists to be individuals and to perform improvisational solos over a familiar melody. This rebellious attitude was not widely embraced at the time, but it was the spark for the civil rights that would continue to grow with blues music and then with Chuck Berry and Little Richard to become rock and roll. This exhibition captures a time when there was beginning to be a shift in America, when a musician would be recognized for their individual talent and gifts, and when an open discussion began about the injustice of segregation. Herman Leonard would be so proud to bring new attention to these musicians that are so important not only to the history of America and their greatest art form, jazz, but to the cultural change that occurred that has allowed us to have an African-American president 60 years later. We're so fortunate that he was there making friends with Dizzy and Miles so that we have this amazing visual record today. Tony Bennett said that 100 years from now, jazz will be regarded in the same high esteem as the great European classics, and I believe that's true. So now I have a short PowerPoint, and then I can answer some questions, and maybe Sean will come up again. This is Herman in 1941. He was born on March 6, 1923. And next week, actually, we'll celebrate his 90th birthday on March 6th. He arrived in New York with his speed graphic camera, an oversized camera by today's standards that made 4 by 5-inch negatives, which explains the clarity and high definition of the images. For each shot, he would load the film plate into the back of the camera. He'd take one shot, pull it out, put it back in, he'd get one more shot. In an evening, maybe he would only take 8 pictures because of this process and the weight of all the equipment. He had 2 strobe lights, which were new to the time, and they were powered by a battery the size of a car battery. So he would go in the club early on, set one light behind the band and another one out in the house to fill the faces, and then would position himself at the front of the stage, or often he would get down next to the drummer and take his shots from there. He ended up having hearing loss because of the drum in his ear every night. Today, with digital photography, it's such a different process where photographers will snap away. There's not even a viewfinder on many cameras, as you know, and they're bam, 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 bam all night. And maybe they get a good shot or maybe they won't. But Herman had, because of his limited opportunity to take shots, he waited, looked at what was in his viewfinder, and waited for that moment that was special. And that's why I think why these are such beautiful shots, in addition to his special lighting. It gave him a signature look. Now, after he graduated from college, he went to Ohio University, which at the time was the only school in the country that offered a degree in photography. He went up to Ottawa, Canada, because he wanted to intern with Yusuf Karsh, the great portrait photographer. And actually, we learned today that there's a portrait of Bill Clinton upstairs by Yusuf Karsh. Karsh couldn't afford to pay Herman, but he let him stay for a year. And one of the first sessions that he went on with him was of Albert Einstein. This is Herman's shot of Einstein. And you can start to see his signature lighting and where it came from. He said Einstein didn't wear socks because his wife had died and she couldn't mend them anymore. He was very humble. He tried to help them move the furniture around for the shot. And he warned of the coming neutron bombs. This was 1948. Then Herman moved to New York in 1948. And the first celebrity he ever photographed was Lena Horne. He was at a club in Harlem, and he met Lena backstage and said, you know, I'm a photographer. I'd love to take photos of you sometime. And she said, well, I've got some time now. I don't have another set for a couple hours. Why don't we do it? So she went with some friends in her car down to his studio in Soho, and they shot for an hour, and she ended up being late getting back to the club. But Herman was so excited, and he made quick contact prints with the negatives and ran back up to the club to show them to Lena, and she was overjoyed, and no wonder. And he said, you know, I'd love to buy you a drink in the club. And she said, I'd love to, Herman, but they don't allow black people in the audience. And he couldn't believe it. The star of the show wasn't allowed in the audience. This is a shot of Louis Armstrong in 1960. Louis, the godfather of jazz. At this time, Herman was living in Paris, and he was working on the set of a film called Paris Blues, which starred Diane Carroll, Paul Newman, and Duke Ellington did the music. Louis Armstrong was also in the film. This shot actually was taken backstage at the Olympia Theater in Paris. Herman was peeking through the curtains and snapped this shot. He said that Louis, you know, is known for his big smile and his handkerchief, but really in his personal life he was quite pensive like this and introspective. And when Herman took the shot, Louis heard the click of the camera and gave him a wink and gave him a smile. The next shot, this is also on the set of Paris Blues. Casual shot. Billie Holiday, one of my favorite artists. This was taken at a little club across the street from her apartment in Harlem. And Herman arrived at her apartment on an assignment for Ebony magazine to photograph her. And when the door opened, there was a woman standing in an apron, and he wasn't quite sure who this was, but she said, oh, I'm sorry, can you just wait a moment? I'm frying a steak for my dog. And it was Billie Holiday. Apparently Billie had just come out of jail at this time, and it's well documented she had a drug problem. But this time she was in great shape, she was very healthy and looked beautiful, and these wonderful portraits. Duke Ellington. This is Paris, Olympia Theater again, 1958. Herman called him the elegant Ellington, the Beethoven of jazz. Such an amazing, prolific composer from the 20s onward. Absolutely one of the all-time greats of jazz. He was a great ladies' man as well, apparently. Herman told this story that, well, I didn't write the whole story down, so I won't even tell you. Sorry about it. Anyway, this is a great shot. It was done with natural stage lighting, and it's like light from heaven. This was in Duke's dressing room, and Herman loved this shot because it epitomized how elegant Duke Ellington was. It wasn't set up at all. This was on the dresser in his room. His patent leather shoes, a silk tie, and a cup of tea, reflection in the mirror behind. And this, I believe, was also on the set of Paris Blues. I've lost my place in my notes, but I'll find it here. Okay, Frank Sinatra. This is Monte Carlo, 1958. And what's great about this, you can tell that it's Frank Sinatra without seeing his face. In the 80s, Quincy Jones took Herman to meet up with Frank at his home in Palm Springs, and Herman brought this print to him as a gift. And immediately Frank said, oh, Monte Carlo, 1958. And who knew? But he knew for some reason. He also said that he had an amazing ear during a recording session. They were recording, he said, wait a minute, there's a note wrong in the score. And they said, no, everything's correct. He said, no, I hear something wrong. And what it turned out, one of the violin players' violin was out of tune, and he heard that among all the other violins, that this one violin was out of tune. And that's the kind of artist he was, that he had that amazing ability. This shot was at a recording session at Capitol Records in LA. And it seems funny that he would wear a hat in a recording session, but I learned last week that he didn't always wear a hat while he was recording, but when he was done recording, he was eager to go home, so he'd put his hat on, and he'd tell the photographer, you got 5 minutes, so this is why he's wearing a hat. Johnny Hodges. So many artists moved to Europe and to France in the 40s and 50s. Jazz was not widely appreciated in the US at that time, but it was overwhelmingly appreciated in Europe, as it still is today. And this was kind of a unique photo for the time, for a white waiter to be serving champagne to a black man, and Herman loved that. Chet Baker, I love this photo because thanks to a friend here tonight, we have the actual trumpet in the exhibit that's in this photo. We did a high-resolution blow-up of the photo and checked the markings, and it's the same trumpet, so very happy to have it here. This is Lester Young's hat, another beautiful still life. It wasn't set up. Lester was rehearsing. He took off his hat, hung it on his case, put his cigarette down on the Coke bottle, and Herman saw the beauty in the moment. Buddy Rich, not known for being a gentle person. Herman discovered that a woman he was dating was Buddy's girlfriend, and he showed up at the recording session the next day, and Buddy gave him a look. It's like, anyway, it didn't go on too long, and there was no fight involved, but just an inside story. This is Art Tatum. Louis Armstrong once said when Art Tatum walked in the room, ladies and gentlemen, God just walked into the house. Most amazing piano player. And he was blind. He was blind in one eye and nearly blind in the other. And as Shana mentioned, Karsh told Herman, photograph the truth, but tell it in terms of beauty. And you can see where Herman adjusted the lighting. His one eye was much larger than the other, but he made a beautiful photo of him. Quincy Jones, a lifelong friend of Herman's. When Quincy moved to Paris as well, he ended up moving into Herman's apartment, and they were roommates for a while. They would go out to the clubs of Paris, and Herman said it was always difficult to go out with Quincy because the girls would always go for him and not for Herman. And Quincy said this is his favorite portrait of himself. Sarah Vaughan, sassy. Herman said there were 3 great jazz singers in his opinion. Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, but Sarah Vaughan was his favorite. Charlie Parker, Yardbird. Birdland was named after him. He died tragically very young, and I believe at age 32. It's well known he had a drug problem. The doctor said at the time his body looked like he was 65 years old. This is a recording session with Charlie and the Metronome All-Stars in 1949. Herman used only one light for this shot. Billy Bauer is on guitar, Eddie Safransky on bass, and Lenny Tristano on piano. And it's not staged, they're just listening back to the recording they just made. And this is Charlie and Dizzy Gillespie, another one of Herman's closest friends, probably the closest one of all the musicians he worked with. They used to love playing chess and backgammon together. And this is Dizzy at the Royal Roost in New York City in 1948. And it's Herman with Dizzy, taken by Quincy Jones. Dizzy was famous for his horn that was bent upward. The story, the way that happened was somebody sat on his horn. He was furious, it bent his horn, and then he realized when he was playing, he could look down at the music and the horn was still pointing up towards the microphone. It worked really well for him, so he continued to use that as his trademark, and then everybody in the band wanted one as well, so everybody had a horn made for everyone. And that's Quincy on the right. Tony Bennett. Tony was one of Herman's best friends. He used to come visit Herman in New Orleans, and they would go to the casinos in Biloxi. There's a sketch in the exhibit downstairs that Tony did of Herman. Tony is a very fine painter, fine artist himself, and he's done many paintings based on Herman's photographs. And Tony used to say about Herman, he's my favorite artist of any genre. He's like the Picasso with his photographs, and they had a very special relationship. This is Oscar Pettiford. It's 1949, and it's just a great example of Herman's signature lighting. Ray Brown, again, Herman liked this shot because the shadow on his face mirrored the shape of the bass. Kenny Clark, Herman thought this was his most perfect photo because of how the lighting just hit everything perfectly. You see the ridge of light around the top of his head and his jacket, and how the light halos the drumsticks and also catches the pocket silk in his jacket. It's a perfect photo. James Moody. Is Linda Moody here? His wife Linda kindly has loaned James' saxophone for the exhibit, and he just passed away about a year ago, and we're hoping she'd be here tonight. And this photo of Dexter Gordon, probably the most famous or most recognized photo of Herman's. It really captures what it was like in 1948 to be in a jazz club. It's amazing how much smoke he could hold in his lungs. This is my personal favorite. Herman set up two lights, one behind Ella's head next to the spotlight, and another one over his right shoulder to fill out the audience. He was seated by the drums, as he always was, and he realized, oh, Duke Ellington's in the front row. And then he got in position to get Duke, and then he realized, oh, Benny Goodman's sitting next to him, so he moved over a little more. And just as he took this shot, Duke brought his hands to his face and got this amazing photo. And if you notice, just to the left of Duke Ellington is Bill Clinton. Not really. Whoopi Goldberg, I saw on The View one morning. Apparently she gave this print to Bill Clinton and said, "How old are you?" Ella Fitzgerald and Ray Brown, they were married, and Herman loved this because if you trace the line around their heads, it makes a heart. Very difficult print to print in the darkroom because his face is in shadow, hers was in full light. And Herman was a master in the darkroom for burning in certain things and dodging things to make a very special print. I mean, down in the exhibit, there's a photo of Dizzy Gillespie, the one you saw earlier from the Royal Roost. One of them belongs to President Clinton. another one is from our collection. And they're quite different. Every print Herman made, there were subtle differences because he really had fun in the darkroom finding little things and burning other things in to make each one unique. This is a shot of Ella at Bop City, New York, 1953. Not a special photo, but it's great to see the scene at the time. I love this one of Ella. You see the sweat rolling down the side of her face. Paris in 1960. Herman shooting Ella in 49. Miles Davis. Herman's quite close with him as well. He told me a story that he was at Miles' house one afternoon, or apartment one afternoon, and Miles was about to go play at a party, and he said, "Why don't you come along with me?" And Herman said, "Well, look how I'm dressed. I can't really go dressed like this." He said, "Don't worry, I'll loan you my tuxedo." So it fit him. So they went to the party, and Miles was performing, and Herman brought along his camera, and he kneeled down to take a picture, and his pants were ripped in two. Miles gave him a look like, "I'm going to kill you." And this is in Malibu in 1989 at Miles' house on the beach in Malibu. Miles also was a fine artist, more abstract in his painting, but extremely talented. And this last photo was taken in 1991 at the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. Quincy had invited Miles here to pay tribute to him. He was very sick at the time. He died a few months later. And you can see it in his eyes. Well, as you know, Herman moved to New Orleans, and when the 17th Street Canal broke, his home got 8 feet of water, and there was a show about to go out for an exhibit in frames, and they sat underwater for 3 weeks, and when the water went down, you'd see that the water had seeped into the frames and then started to mold, but then stopped. And at first it was, terrible. 8,000 prints were lost. But these prints, Herman ended up loving. The Smithsonian now owns several of them. And Herman said, "This is a work of Herman Leonard and Mother Nature." And that's a self-portrait of Herman in 2004. And the last shot, we went to Eleuthera in the Bahamas in 2010. Herman did a photo session there with Lenny Kravitz, who I used to manage. And Lenny took this shot, which I think is fantastic. And that's it for my PowerPoint. If anyone has any questions. Apparently, there's microphones at the end of the aisles if anybody wants to ask anything. If not, we can go downstairs and see the exhibit. Oh, yeah, we have music too. I'm sorry. Jumped the gun. Are you ready to go, Rodney?
I want to say thank you to the Clinton Foundation for inviting us. We feel very honored to be here. And as we were watching the slide presentation, you just think about the Miles Davis, the Duke, Sarah, Art Tatum, and they were basically creating something out of nothing. So today, in 2013, we truly stand on the shoulders of giants. If you've ever traveled outside of the U.S. and you play this thing called jazz music, it's like gold. And even if you don't speak the language, people are right there with you. So we're very honored to be here tonight, and we're going to offer a couple of selections. Since I'm a trumpet player, since Miles is my favorite, and he made this song famous. He didn't write it, but it's called Bye Bye Blackbird.
So it wouldn't be right. We didn't have a nice vocalist like Sarah or Billie Holiday. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring to the microphone the lovely Bijou doing a song that Louis and Ella made famous. It's called The Nearness of You.
It's not the pain that excites me.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the members of the band. Sam Carroll on piano, Mike Chairman on drums, Oliver Thomas on bass. My name is Rodney on trumpet. We're going to change it up just a little, because earlier I found out that Mr. Steve used to live in New Orleans. So is it all right if we go to New Orleans just for a little bit? Is that okay? Anybody ever been to Bourbon Street? If you want to move around, it's all right. just came out. October is a jazz and hip hop kind of mashed together. So you can see my main man, Patrick, in the back of the room if you want to take me home with you tonight. Definitely, this will be our last tune. Definitely stick around, check out the exhibit. And if you want to get more jazz, we'll be over at the Zen Wine Bar, just a few blocks over 300 River Market Avenue. So come hang out with us, and we're going to have a fun time. That starts at 9 o'clock. So thank you again for hanging out. This is a tune that Miles Davis made real cool.